June 28, 1944. Smoke hung low over the shattered hedgerow. The air reeked of diesel, cordite, and damp earth, twisted like melted rubber. From a shallow ditch near the division raised his glass, he could see what was left. The German Tiger tanks hidden among the bocage lowered the binoculars and exhaled. 75 millimeters of armor, he muttered. They send them at us like Sherman was no match for the Tiger's 88 millimeter cannon, and the proof lay burning in the valley below. The men joked that the Allies must have an endless supply of these Tommy cookers, the nickname they'd given to Shermans for how easily they burned when hit. More Shermans, hundreds of them, crawling through the dust, brand new. The Americans hadn't even taken a day to regroup. Richter frowned. How? He whispered. It was the same road, the same valley, yet the tanks returned as if nothing had been lost. Each bore the fresh green paint of new armor. No dents, no burn marks. It was as if someone had pressed a button and conjured a new army overnight. The Tiger crews watching through their optics could hardly believe it. They had spent months waiting for spare parts, cannibalizing wrecks just to keep their tanks running. One broken track could sideline a Tiger for weeks, yet the Americans seemed to replace entire battalions in days. By dusk, the battlefield that morning's fighting had emptied was once again alive with Allied armor. Sherman after Sherman rolled forward, supported by half-tracks and infantry, radios crackling with crisp commands. The German gunners, exhausted and running low on ammunition, stared through their scopes at an enemy that appeared endless. For the first time, some of them began to feel a cold dread, a realization creeping in behind the smoke and fire. They were fighting a nation that could build faster than they could destroy. That night, under a blood-orange sky, Richter sat beside a captured U.S. tank, its metal still warm. He traced the manufacturer's plate riveted near the engine block, built in Detroit, Michigan, 1944. Detroit. He didn't know where that was, but the name alone felt powerful, industrial, unstoppable. Maybe it's true what they say, murmured Unteroffizier Weber, sitting nearby. The Americans make tanks like sausages. Richter didn't reply. He just looked at the endless convoy of trucks rolling past on the distant road, hauling fuel, shells, and food. Even in retreat, the Germans had never seen logistics like this. Factories across the Atlantic were feeding this front, one crate at a time, across oceans and battlefields. In that moment, the idea of victory felt like a relic from another war.
Endless Shermans crawling through the Norman countryside. Across the Atlantic, another kind of army was at war, one without uniforms, rifles, or medals. Detroit, Michigan, January 1944. The rhythmic pounding of machinery filled the Ford River Rouge plant. Sparks rained from welders' torches like molten stars. Assembly lines stretched for miles, pulsing with motion. Men and women, some barely out of high school, moved with practiced precision, fitting treads, riveting armor plates, and wiring radios. Every 25 minutes, a new Sherman tank rolled off the line. Every 25 minutes. Charles Sorensen, Henry Ford's production chief, had once promised the government he could mass-produce tanks the same way he built cars. Many in Washington had laughed at the idea. But now, as 1944 dawned, Ford's promise wasn't just real, it was reshaping the war. Nearby, the Chrysler tank arsenal in Warren thundered day and night. Workers there called it the arsenal of democracy. echoing Roosevelt's famous phrase. The phrase wasn't propaganda, it was an accurate description. In a single month, Chrysler produced more tanks than all of Germany could in the same period. Women like Rosie Patterson, who had never seen a tank before the war, were now experts at assembling their engines. Teenagers too young to enlist handled wrenches and rivet guns. Every civilian was part of the same invisible front. The secret was scale. The U.S. didn't just build tanks. It built factories that built tanks. The River Rouge complex alone consumed more steel than some nations mined in a year. Trains unloaded ore, coal, and rubber on one side of the facility and shipped out completed Shermans on the other. And it wasn't just Detroit. Across America, a network of plants, General Motors in Cleveland, Fisher Body in Grand Rapids, and Pressed Steel in Illinois, poured out hulls, turrets, engines, and transmissions, all interchangeable. A single Tiger tank took months of careful hand assembly by skilled craftsmen. A Sherman could be produced in less than a week by 1,000 hands working in rhythm. The result? When hundreds of Shermans burned in Normandy's hedgerows, hundreds more were already steaming across the Atlantic, packed in Liberty ships. The same industrial might that had once built cars for America's highways was now paving the road to Berlin. Back in France, captured German officers like Richter would later recall the shock of hearing these numbers. During interrogation, one officer asked a U.S. colonel how long it took to replace a destroyed Sherman. The American simply smiled and said, "By the time you're finished counting that wreck, its replacement's already halfway here." For Germany, each Tiger loss was a national setback. For America, a destroyed Sherman was just another entry on a production list. Even as the factories roared, their workers understood the stakes. Every bolt tightened, every panel welded, meant another crew might live to see home again. By spring 1944, the United States had built more than 50,000 Shermans. So many that they filled entire ports, stacked row upon row like green steel waves waiting to cross the ocean. When the invasion of Normandy began, it wasn't just soldiers landing, it was the embodiment of American industry, arriving in force. Richter could never have seen the factories, the railways, or the women welding in goggles and gloves, but he was witnessing their impact. Every tank that reappeared in the fields of France was a message from across the ocean. You can destroy one army, but you can't destroy an assembly line.
France. Rain fell in sheets, turning the earth to thick mud. The shattered hulls of tanks dotted the horizon, some German, some American, all silent monuments to the violence that had swept the fields only hours before. In a barn converted into a command post, Captain James McCall of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division leaned over a map littered with grease pencil markings. His unit had lost 23 Shermans in 2 days. Under normal circumstances, such losses would cripple a division, but McCall wasn't worried. Reinforcements were already en route from the coast. "They'll be here tomorrow," his supply sergeant assured him. "Straight off the ships. Brand new M4A3s. Smell of fresh paint." McCall nodded. It was just the way things worked now. When the Germans destroyed a tank, they celebrated. When an American lost one, they filled out a requisition form. That same week, a few miles north, Oberleutnant Karl Richter and his platoon of Tiger crews sat huddled in a muddy orchard waiting for fuel that never arrived. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies, and Allied bombers had shredded rail lines across France. Even when a Tiger survived combat, it might be abandoned simply because there wasn't enough gasoline to move it. Richter's radio crackled with orders: defend the line, hold position. But his tanks were little more than immovable bunkers.
He had read that German industry had produced fewer than 1,400 Tiger tanks during the entire war. Meanwhile, America had produced over 10 times that number of Shermans just in the previous year. The imbalance was staggering. While German engineers perfected every bolt of their tanks, the Americans perfected the process of making them. At the front, it was visible in every encounter. When a Tiger knocked out a Sherman, another would take its place minutes later, sometimes 2, sometimes 10. To the men inside those tanks, the difference meant survival. The Sherman crews were painfully aware of their machine's vulnerabilities. They knew a Tiger could destroy them from a mile away, while their own gun might barely scratch the German armor. Yet morale remained high, not because of confidence in the tank's strength, but in the knowledge that they would never run out of machines, fuel, or ammunition. Behind the scenes, American logistics worked like clockwork. Trains, trucks, and ships moved 24 hours a day. Replacement tanks were loaded onto Liberty ships at U.S. ports, sailed across U-boat-infested waters, and rolled straight into combat within weeks. Richter watched one of these convoys from a ridge outside Villers-Bocage. His binoculars showed columns of green armor stretching to the horizon. "So many," one of his crew whispered. "It's like the earth grows them." He didn't respond. What could he say? The German factories bombed by the RAF lay in ruins. Synthetic fuel plants were failing. Skilled machinists had been drafted or killed. And yet, here were the Americans, pouring out tanks, trucks, planes, and ammunition at a rate no nation in history had ever achieved. Even Hitler's generals began to acknowledge it privately. The war was no longer a contest of tactics or bravery, but one of mathematics. For every Tiger built in Germany, 10 Shermans left American docks. For every Panzer that broke down in the mud, another dozen American tanks rumbled onto French soil. The balance of war had shifted from craftsmanship to capacity. Richter could feel it, even if no one dared speak it aloud. The grim understanding that Germany wasn't losing battles, it was being drowned by production. As the night deepened, the sound of distant tank engines filled the air again, low, steady, and endless. The same sound that haunted his dreams. He turned to his driver. "Start the engine," he said quietly. "We'll fall back. There's no stopping that many." Outside, somewhere beyond the rain and smoke, the arsenal of democracy was still moving forward.
France. The counterattack had failed. The German panzer columns that once thundered west now lay in twisted heaps across the fields. Allied aircraft prowled the skies like hawks, striking anything that moved. The once proud 2nd Panzer Division was in ruins, its Tigers and Panthers gutted by airstrikes and artillery. Oberlieutenant Karl Richter had spent 3 days on the run before being surrounded by American infantry near a hedgerow crossroads. Exhausted and half-starved, he surrendered without resistance. His sidearm clattered to the mud, and a young American sergeant motioned for him to sit. The next morning, Richter and a handful of captured officers were transported to a temporary prisoner-of-war camp set up in an open field behind the American lines. It wasn't the misery he expected. They were given food, hot coffee, real bread, even cigarettes. He hadn't tasted coffee in months. Nearby, he watched convoys of trucks unloading crates marked with bold black letters, U.S. Ordnance Corps. Crates of tank treads, spare engines, gun barrels, piled higher than a man's head. Mechanics worked under makeshift tents, refitting Shermans with new armor plates and painting identification numbers on their turrets. One American officer noticed Richter's gaze and smiled. "You like our setup, Captain?" Richter hesitated. "You replaced tanks, right here?" The officer laughed. "Hell yeah, half our workshops are mobile now. We fix him in the field and send him back out tomorrow." Richter looked away, embarrassed by how quickly the Americans could recover. His own unit had waited weeks for a single new engine back in Normandy. That afternoon, Richter and a handful of captured officers were taken to an interrogation tent. On the table lay a map of Europe, and beside it a thick folder stamped War Department Production Report. His interrogator, a calm, confident major, offered him a seat. "Tell me, Oberlieutenant," the major said conversationally, "how many tanks does Germany produce each month?" Richter hesitated. "Perhaps 200? The American nodded. "That sounds about right. We're doing about 2,500. Richter blinked. 2,500? Every month? The major opened the folder and turned it toward him. Inside were neat columns of figures, graphs, and photos, shipyards, tank factories, aircraft assembly lines, dozens of them. "We have plants in Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, California, each one working around the clock. If we lose a tank in France, it's already replaced before the crew is even reported missing." Richter leaned back in his chair, silent. He wasn't sure what shocked him more, the scale or the casual confidence with which the man said it. Later, as dusk settled over the camp, Richter sat alone, watching the horizon. Beyond the fences, he could see more tanks moving east, columns of Shermans, the faint rumble of their engines vibrating through the ground. Each one a product of that unimaginable machine across the ocean. He remembered the factory plate he had once seen, Detroit, Michigan. It now carried an entirely different weight. Back home, his family lived in a small town where a single steel mill supplied parts for half a dozen tanks a month. Germany had pride, skill, and courage, but the Americans had systems, machines, and a nation that had turned its economy into a weapon. The war, he realized, wasn't being decided by who fought harder. It was being decided by who could build longer.
Inside the Arsenal of Democracy. September 1944. Camp Swift, Texas. The sun burned white over the endless horizon. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across the prairie, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside, thousands of German POWs lived under the strange rhythm of captivity. Roll call, meals, mail, and labor. Among them was Oberleutnant Karl Richter. Months earlier, he had commanded a Tiger platoon. Now, he wore faded khaki overalls and pushed a wheelbarrow full of lumber at a military depot. The Americans treated him fairly, strict but not cruel, and that alone unsettled him. But what astonished him most wasn't the treatment. It was what he saw beyond the camp fences. Every morning, trucks and trains rumbled past carrying machinery, fuel, and steel. On weekends, when POWs were allowed to work under guard outside the camp, Richter saw the world that had built the army which defeated his own. He saw vast rail yards where locomotives pulled mile-long trains loaded with tanks. He saw factories stretching beyond the horizon, their smokestacks painting the sky with black plumes. Everywhere there was movement, machines, cranes, people, all part of some immense, coordinated effort. In one assignment, Richter and several prisoners were sent to a nearby assembly plant to move lumber and scrap. The plant foreman, an older man with grease-stained hands, didn't seem to care that they were prisoners. "Work steady," he said. "You'll get lunch same as the rest." Richter followed his orders and worked silently. But what he witnessed left him speechless. The plant floor was a living organism. Conveyors rattled, welding torches hissed, and sparks flew like fireworks. Men and women of every age worked side by side, building components for tanks and trucks bound for Europe. The foreman noticed Richter staring. "Never seen anything like it, huh?" Richter shook his head slowly. "In Germany, a factory this large would need permission from the army, plans from Berlin." The man laughed. "Around here, we don't wait for Berlin, we just build." At lunch, Richter sat in silence, listening to the workers talk. About their husbands and sons overseas, about rationing, about the next production quota. They spoke with pride, not fear. For them, this was their battlefield. He realized something profound then. The Americans had no single front. The entire nation was the front. From the farmers growing wheat in Kansas to the welders in Chicago, from the shipbuilders in San Francisco to the engineers in Detroit, every citizen was part of the same campaign. The difference between America and Germany wasn't just resources. It was unity of purpose. That evening, back in the camp, Richter wrote a letter to his wife, one that would never pass the censor's table. He wrote, "We believed victory came from courage and discipline. But here I see victory comes from organization. Every man, woman, and machine is part of one great engine. We fought soldiers. They fight with factories." Weeks later, news filtered through the camp. Paris had been liberated. The Allies were advancing towards Germany. The men whispered rumors of overwhelming numbers, tanks, trucks, planes, all American-built. Richter didn't doubt it for a second. He had seen where they came from. When he finally lay down to sleep that night, the distant echo of trains and factory whistles haunted his dreams. Not the sound of war itself, but of something even more unstoppable: production. It was then that he understood. America's greatest weapon wasn't the Sherman tank, nor the bombs, nor the ships. It was the system that made them endless. And no army, however brave, could fight against infinity.